it going, guys? It's Declan from Lakehoe Properties here, and we're going to follow on from our previous video on landlord responsibilities. So this is landlord responsibilities part 2. Now, if you read the last one or watched the last video, you will have had your safety and compliance sorted out. So now we're going to take a look at what you need to do next. So let's assume you found a tenant, agreed the terms of the new tenancy, and you're preparing the relevant paperwork. What do you need to include? Okay, right to rent checks. So before any documentation is drawn up, you're going to need to complete what's known as a right to rent check. Now, essentially this is where the landlord or the agent has to have sight of documentation for the tenants that proves their right to reside in the UK. And this can be anything from a passport to a visa document, and there's other acceptable documents too, including a birth certificate or a letter from their employer confirming that they have verified their right to work in the UK. Now, it's not always immediately obvious to the untrained eye as to what is a valid or acceptable document, and indeed whether that document is genuine. So if ever you have any doubt, you should contact the Home Office helpline, and we'll pop a link down below at the bottom of the video for you to use. Remember, if your tenant has a time-limited visa, you're going to need to arrange for a follow-up check to ensure that their right to rent resumes. There are significant penalties, including a fine of up to £3,000 for each tenant that landlords face if they're found to have rented their property to a tenant or an individual who does not have the right to remain in the UK. We'll start things off with the Assured Shorthold Tenancy, or AST. Now, this document forms the basis for the tenancy. It outlines important information such as the start and end date of the tenancy, the amount of rent due, the amount of deposit due, and the date that the rent is due, and obligations that must be kept by both the landlord and tenant. This document needs to be signed by all parties prior to the commencement of the tenancy. The How to Rent Guide. Now, this is a prescribed document drawn up by the government to ensure that tenants enter into a transaction with as much knowledge as possible. This document must be issued to each named tenant prior to the commencement of a tenancy, and ideally at the point of viewing a property. Failure to issue this document can have detrimental ramifications if ever you needed to seek possession of the property via the courts. The EPC, or the Energy Performance Certificate. Whilst this certificate must be present during the marketing of the property, it must also be issued to each named tenant prior to the commencement of the tenancy. Again, failure to issue this document to each individual tenant can have detrimental ramifications if ever you needed to seek possession of the property via the courts. So a gas safety certificate must be completed and issued to each individual tenant prior to the commencement of a tenancy. You must have a valid certificate throughout the duration of the tenancy, and a copy must be served within 28 days to each tenant when it's renewed. Failure to do so can have detrimental ramifications if ever you needed to seek possession of the property via the courts. And moreover, there are civil and criminal penalties for not having a valid gas safety certificate where there is gas present in a property. The Electrical Installation Condition Report. Much like gas safety certificates and the EPC, this must be issued prior to the commencement of a tenancy, and again whenever that certificate is renewed. There's more information on this within the previous post and video on Landlord Responsibilities Part 1 on all 3 certificates. The Tenancy Deposit Certificate. The tenancy deposit must be registered and protected within 30 days of receiving it with an approved scheme. That could be the TDS, the DPS, or My Deposits. The certificate must be issued to each named tenant and remain protected throughout the duration of the tenancy. Failure to protect the deposit within the 30-day time frame can result in the tenant being awarded up to 3 times the deposit amount, which is to be paid by the landlord. Failure to issue the certificate to a tenant can have a detrimental effect if ever you needed to seek possession of the property via the courts. Prescribed information. This document outlines the details of the deposit, the tenant and landlord contact information, the amount held, and information as to what will happen at the end of a tenancy in relation to the deposit. Again, failure to serve this document can have detrimental impact if ever you needed to seek possession of the property via the courts, and you may be spotting a theme here. The Deposit Scheme Terms and Conditions or Guide. Much like the How to Rent Guide, this document gives the tenant important information and helps them to understand their rights and responsibilities, as well as the scheme's own terms and conditions with regards to the protection of their deposit. Failure to issue this document can have a detrimental impact if ever you needed to seek possession of the property via the courts. Privacy notice and GDPR compliance. So if you're using an agency to let your property, the agent will provide their privacy policy as standard, and it's typically found on their website. What most landlords don't realise is that where they act on their own behalf, they must be registered with the EICR, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, as a data controller, and they must therefore have a privacy policy in order to ensure any personal information they hold for a tenant, past or present, is handled in a safe and appropriate manner. Smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. The landlord must confirm at commencement of each tenancy that the smoke alarms are present on each habitable floor and that they're in a working and audible order. With carbon monoxide alarms, they must be present and working and audible in any room where there's a solid fuel burning appliance. As with smoke alarms, this must be confirmed at the commencement of a tenancy. So everything we've just mentioned forms what is known as the Deregulation Act of 2015, and this affects tenancies that commenced on or after October the 1st, 2015. Under this regulation, landlords would lose their right to serve a Section 21 notice and could face fines of up to £5,000 if they're not compliant. There's a lot to think about here, which is why many landlords prefer to use a professional agent to ensure that they are compliant. If you have any questions on anything we've mentioned, or any of our previous posts, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks very much.